I just realized I was mute there. Sorry about that, folks. Just noticed the mute notice. I'd like to welcome all of you again to Toronto Apologetics, and thank you for giving up your evening, your afternoon to be with us today. And just want to encourage our viewers, if you have not done so already, to subscribe to Toronto Apologetics. And it's a ministry dedicated to the defense of the Christian faith. It's a ministry dedicated to engaging other worldviews and other religions and cults and other groups. And so, welcome. And tonight, we have a special guest with us, and I've been looking forward to having our special guest with us. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Steve Daly onto the program. Dr. Daly, it's such a pleasure to have you with us on Toronto Apologetics.
Well, thank you, Tony. Appreciate the invitation very much.
Thank you. And so, folks, we're going to be discussing a little bit about Dr. Daly's book, which is entitled Ellen G. White, a Psychobiography. And there's a link to that in the description. You can check out Dr. Daly's website. And this is a great book. I couldn't put it down, and it's just chock full of information, biographical information on Ellen White and the origins of Seventh Day Adventism. So maybe you can tell us a little bit, Steve, about your upbringing as a Seventh Day Adventist. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure, be glad to. I was born into an Adventist home. My mom came out of pretty strict Adventist background families. Her mother was a Super E.G. White fan, and she married my dad, who wasn't, he had a little bit of Adventist background, but they were pretty much backslidden, and she kind of insisted that he get baptized the day before they got married. So we always joked about him having a shotgun baptism. But, he had to get baptized in order for her to marry her, kind of thing. And I was the firstborn. I was born unexpectedly. My dad was actually trying out with the St. Louis Cardinals and playing in their minor league system. And he was a great athlete. And me being born really kind of threw a wrench into things for him, because they didn't pay anything back in those days, especially in the minor leagues. So he was a physical therapist, and he went to work doing that, and really raised me to be an athlete. From the time I was a tiny little kid, he was having me hold on to bars and, do all kinds of exercise stuff, and taught me baseball, football, basketball, tennis, all sports that I loved. And I went to public school and excelled well in those sports, and was also doing really well in Little League and Pop Warner. And, Santa Rosa had a fantastic sports system in the secular arena. And my mom, of course, wanted all three of us boys to be in Adventist schools. So she was always pushing for that. And she finally kind of won that battle when I was in seventh grade and got transferred to an Adventist school. And that was very traumatic for me, because at that time, Adventists didn't allow any competitive sports, no sports with other schools. The track at Redwood Empire Junior Academy was a big swamp. When I walked into the gym, it was an old hangar with the rims hanging at 45-degree angle with no nets. I thought I was in hell. I just couldn't believe how bad it was. The PE teacher was a Bible teacher who was just teaching PE, and didn't know the rules to baseball, football, basketball. It was just completely unbelievable. So I was pretty unhappy about that, and kind of felt that my parents betrayed me in terms of what I was wanting to do with my life. And that was kind of the end of my serious sports career. And so, I was pretty rebellious about that. I didn't like Adventism anyway, just from Sabbath schools and things. I I felt it was a ridiculous religion telling me I had to be sinlessly perfect, and it was just so unrealistic that I wondered, why would anybody in their right mind believe this stuff? And so I was a little rebellious against it before, but then I went into kind of total rebellion after I had my sports life sabotaged. And, I was probably the last kid in my eighth grade, ninth grade classes that they thought would ever go into the ministry. That was unthinkable. I could hardly say a sentence without profanity. And I was quite popular with the guys because I was the best one in sports in the school. Um, and most of the guys were into cussing and swearing and stuff anyway. Not very many of them took Adventism seriously. But what really changed my life wasn't anything to do with Adventism. It was something to do with God. When I was 16 years old, my birthday's on New Year's Eve, and I was really kind of in the full state of rebellion at that point. And we were having a big unchaperoned New Year's Eve party in Neely's Orchard, which was just down the street from where I lived. And they had a big barn there, and it was going to be no adults. And I just was thinking, now's the time for me to start getting drunk and maybe trying drugs and testing some sexual boundaries and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm walking through this prune orchard where I'd pick prunes many occasions, and a direct voice. I mean, this was just so unmistakable. It was ridiculous. And God just directly spoke to me and said, if you go in there, your life will never be the same. Go home and go to bed. And I was just so flabbergasted that God would talk to me, because I was so screwed up and so rebellious and so out of it. And that just completely changed my thinking, that God loved me, cared about my future. So that was my real conversion, that experience in that prune orchard. And, what happened after that was I went away to Rio Linda Academy, which was a boarding Adventist academy. And it was about as strict and legalistic and perfectionistic in their teaching and their standards and how they enforce things. It was a real nightmare. And I was right in the middle of the baby boom, and my friends were getting kicked out like mad. I was well enough behaved not to get kicked out, but I was really growing spiritually at that point, just reading on my own and not taking Adventism particularly seriously, but realizing that the God that I'd been exposed to in Adventism was nothing like the real God. And I wanted to witness for the real God. So I decided I'd go into the ministry and see if I could make a positive impact in Adventism, because it really needed a lot of help. It was not gospel-centered, Christ-centered, God-centered. It was a messed up religion, but it was what I'd grown up in. And, it was kind of the bloom where you are planted thing. See if you can make a positive difference. God was just convicting me to do that. So I went into the ministry, and people often ask, why'd you stay in the Adventist ministry for 35 years when you were never convinced by Adventism really from the beginning? And it was because I felt God was convicting me. And also there were several occasions where I wanted to leave. I started, one of the big things was Des Ford. I don't know if you know who he is, but he really tried to bring the gospel into Adventism, and a bunch of us young ministers dearly loved him. And he
Yeah.
got kicked out of the church in 1980. And a number of young ministers left. And the only reason I didn't leave then was because I'd just been called to be the campus chaplain of Loma Linda University, which was the biggest university in the church. And that was a very big surprise to me, and I think everyone else that was vying for the job. And I was only 27 years old, which was remarkably young for that particular position. And God was just convicting me. I'm giving you this position to do what I want you to do. And it had a lot of political stuff to it. It wasn't always fun, but it was a great opportunity to do a lot of things and have a lot of influence over a lot of young people and preach in a huge university church on a regular basis. And I started attending the Vineyard in 1985 because I felt that Adventism was just so spiritually sterile that I needed something healthy. And I got to know John Wimber there, and I loved him. He was just like a spiritual father to me. And I asked him, after I'd been there for almost a year, if he would be open to me coming and joining the Vineyard. And he said, I absolutely would. I'd love it. But, I'm convicted in my spirit that God's really put you in a very influential position for a reason. And pray about that. And I did. I kept praying about it. And God convicted me of the same thing, stay in Adventism till they get rid of you. And so from 1985, even in 79, 80, I was ready to leave with Ford, ready to leave again with Wimber in 85. But God just kept giving me great opportunities. I wrote a book called Adventism for a New Generation that had a huge influence in the denomination. It was extremely Christ-centered, Spirit-led. The Adventists don't have any kind of decent understanding of the doctrine of the Holy Spirit or the spirit realm, period. So I put all this stuff in that book, and it ended up being used as a textbook in most of our colleges and universities. So I had an opportunity to travel all over the world, speak at all the universities. So it really opened a tremendous amount of doors for me. But I was always on the edge of getting kicked out. I thought I would get kicked out for sure when I wrote that book because it had some really strong stuff in it against the organization, the structure, the hierarchy, the spirit of control, just all the real obvious problems with Adventism. But I had these university people around me who loved me, and I was well loved on my campus and stuff. So they kind of protected me from all the attacks, and I certainly did get a lot of attacks. But the interesting thing was I wasn't just attacked by the right wing of Adventism. Um, La Sierra, it became La Sierra University in the early 90s. Before that, Loma Linda and La Sierra were just one university, but they split because they're two different campuses, and one became the undergraduate La Sierra University, the other became the medical Loma Linda University. But anyway, when they split, it was a big deal, of course, on the campus and stuff. And I ended up playing a real key role in that whole thing politically. So the bottom line was that La Sierra had the most liberal faculty in all of Adventism. In Southern California, Adventists are always kind of dismissed as being liberal anyway. But these guys had all gone to Harvard and University of Chicago, and the top faculty that were running the show, they put these people into administration in 1997, and they put in what was called a core program. And this was straight out of leftist. I don't know what your politics are, but this was straight out of leftist woke.
Yeah.
See,
Very much like Canada. Yeah.
I mean, it was unbelievable what they brought into our campus and forced the students to take it. And the students absolutely hated it because it required all these core classes that were left wing, politically ridiculous stuff. And they were teaching Jesus wasn't God, God's not a personal being. Monotheism is the worst form, evil form of religion. All this stuff is being required of freshmen to take. And, I had students and their parents just coming in my office and crying. And how can this be? How can this be an Adventist school? They lied to us about teaching Adventism and all this stuff. And, it was really true that this administration was just as dishonest and deceptive as they could possibly be. So I ended up standing for the students and their concerns and became the lightning rod for speaking out against the administration. And they were just out to kill me. I mean, I was the enemy number one. So now I got the taste of leftism, which is really more brutal than right wing stuff. What I experienced under the dishonesty of leftism and Adventism was way worse than all the garbage I'd experienced from right wing Adventism. So I left the university. The last year was just hell over all this stuff. But the board came in, they got rid of these administrators, they got rid of the core program. So I was kind of the sacrificial lamb, but I had to get out of there because what they were doing to the students, lying to the parents, it was just so disgusting. I couldn't stand it. But then I became the pastor of Celebration Center, which was kind of a very progressive Adventist church that was meant to reach out to non-Adventists or former Adventists. It was trying to bring Adventists who'd left the church back in. So we kind of had special rules and were allowed to operate in a way that most Adventist churches weren't. But even there, most of our congregation wouldn't have called themselves Adventists. I didn't think of myself as an Adventist at all. And by 2010, most of our congregation just left with me, and we had an interdenominational church, and I'm still pastoring that church now. But, I don't have regrets about being born into Adventism, or I certainly had incredible opportunities in Adventism that I'm very thankful and grateful for. And I always get labeled as this angry guy who can't stand Ellen White and hates Ellen White and all this kind of stuff, which is completely untrue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at you, Steve. You have a very winsome face, a very friendly face.
Yeah, I'm not angry at all about Adventism. I'm grateful for the years I spent in it. I felt like I made a real difference, helping a lot of people understand the true gospel, helping them understand the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. So God used me to touch a lot of people during those 35 years. And, the whole time I was there, I knew that Adventism was diluted, thinking they're the true remnant church, criticizing all the other churches. Believing Ellen White's the great last prophet to the world. They were just so full of themselves and really just basic stupidity that I preached against this stuff my whole 35 years. And that's why I was always kind of on the verge of getting fired. But, I think it really did a lot of good. I think I was able to reach a lot of people. And a lot of the former Adventists that have left the church have told me that my books and my work and stuff had played a significant role in that. But I don't know if you have more questions, but I can transition into how I kind of ended up writing the psychobiography.
Yeah. I mean, this book, and everyone, just to let you know, Dr. Steve Daly's book, Ellen G. White, a psychobiography. This is a great book. It is one I highly recommend. Very well documented, and it's available on Dr. Daly's website, which I provided in the description box, and it's also available on Amazon, I believe. It's available on other platforms too. So tell us a little bit, because when we really think of Seventh Day Adventism, we really need to look at the foundations. We start with the Millerite movement, of course, with the Great Disappointment.
Yeah.
And William Miller. I'm a Baptist as well, Brother Steve. And so William Miller was a Baptist minister who went against the Lord's warnings not to set dates, not to play with dates. He clearly told us that on more than one occasion. And he went ahead anyway and read Daniel 8 I believe verse 14 about the sanctuary being cleansed.
Right.
And of course, Miller took that to mean the earth, that Christ would return, and he took the 1260 days and filled with the numbers, and it brought him. I think originally it was October 22nd, 1843, and then it was pushed a year into October of 1844. And Ellen White was a disciple of William Miller, a Millerite. Every time I think of Miller, I can't help think of the beer, Miller beer.
Right.
But so maybe take us from that point, because a lot of folks don't understand that. First John 2 says that they went out from us because they were never of us, and so the cults all came out of the church, whether it's Mormonism, Christian Science, whether it's Jehovah's Witnesses. Ellen White was a Methodist. And maybe you can start with that, Steve, that
Yeah.
it begins with the Ellen White, a Methodist, but who was also a member of William Miller's group, and she was caught up with this idea of 1844.
Yeah. I'll make just a couple brief summary statements so people understand that, Ellen White, the way they try to portray her today, this is a book that's just been written by a bunch of scholars in the Adventist Church, Reclaiming the Prophet. And I've been reviewing it on my thread, but it's really funny because what they're trying to do is admit that all the research over the last 50 years, and the reason I say 50 years is because after Ellen White died, she put the White estate into place to continue her legacy.
Right.
And in 1919, which was 4 years after her death, the church leaders, many of whom were pretty progressive at that point, A.G. Daniels was the GC president, and they wanted to kind of clear the air about Ellen White because they knew there were so many false beliefs, so many false teachings that had been laid on the church. And so they called this big 1919 Bible conference, which was mainly just scholars, teachers, supposed to be kind of the top echelon of the church. And they all came together, and it was a very productive, very interesting set of meetings when you read the transcripts. But what happened was they swore everyone to secrecy. This was to be top secret. The lay people were not to know what they were talking about. But there were a few super right-wingers there who were hiding their identity, and they couldn't compare to the arguments. They didn't even attempt to take on these guys that were much smarter than them and much more truthful than them. But they were just boiling to the point of insanity, basically, by the time these meetings were over. And they could hardly wait to get out of there, go back on their oath of confidentiality, blow the whistle on all these guys, try to get Daniels put out of office, which they did. They got rid of Daniels and Prescott and all these kind of progressive leaders that were in charge at that point. And they buried those minutes, those transcripts. They were buried in the GC archives, never to be brought out again. That was their intention. And Adventism really entered its darkest age at that point. If you want to look at the absolute worst, most ridiculous right-wing years of Adventism, they started from 1920 and went to 1950, basically. And that's when Francis Nichol was running the show, and he wrote Ellen G. White and Her Critics, which supposedly wiped out Can Wright and every person who'd ever criticized Ellen White. And the guy was completely dishonest. I've exposed a number of his gross dishonesties, which included the amalgamation of man and beast, all the shut door stuff, things I'll mention. But anyway, that 30-year period was just absolutely the dark ages of Adventism. And then you had the Figueroa administration come in the 1950s, and these guys were more evangelical. And they're the ones that lied to Martin and deceived Martin. And when Martin asked him, hey, you're telling me all this stuff, but I go into your bookstores and I see F.D. Nichol and M.L. Andreasen, and these are the most right-wing perfectionistic idiots I've ever read. Oh, we're just so open as a people that we allow these most marginated people even to sell books in our stores, which was a complete lie. Nickel and Andreasen were the most popular Adventist books at that time, but they
Yeah.
completely lied to Martin and told him,
Yeah.
"Oh, those don't represent the church at all. We'll prove it to
Yeah.
you by writing this book called Questions on Doctrine,"
Let me
which
just
was
make a comment, Steve, if you don't mind, just for our
yeah,
viewers. So when
sure.
Dr. Daly is talking about Martin, he's referring to Walter Martin.
Right,
So the author of Kingdom of the Cults, the who was considered the leading authority in cult evangelism. So he's referring to Dr. Walter Martin.
right.
So keep that in mind, folks. So if you have a copy of Kingdom of the Cults, an old copy, the Seventh Day Adventism is in the appendix, and Martin was clearly hoodwinked by a lot of these Adventists. And so that's what Dr. Daly is referring to, just for clarification. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go
Martin
ahead.
had Martin had openly labeled and exposed Adventists as a cult in his books before that. And the one that came out right before Kingdom of the Cults, uh, Figure and the administration felt really betrayed that he still included them as a cult in that. So he felt bad about it. He felt that that was kind of a publishing error that wasn't able to be corrected before the book was published. So he was kind of really wanting to make that up to them. And then when they showed him the book Questions on Doctrine, oh, look, we're evangelical Christians, all this kind of stuff. The bottom line was they all got kicked out of office and Questions on Doctrine got removed from publication. So these guys had a very short window of influence, and all the right wingers came in after them again. But they did do the one great accomplishment of deceiving Martin and getting removed from his main four major cults, Kingdom of the Cults book. So that was, again, even the progressive Adventists were grossly dishonest. That's what I like to point out. These people claim they knew the gospel, but they're lying through their teeth and they're completely deceiving Walter Martin for their own self-centered purposes, and completely misrepresenting the Adventist Church and what it actually is. And this has just been the history of Adventism. It's a history of gross dishonesty. It's a history of gross cover-ups. Um, it's a history of fanaticism and the most bizarre kind of beliefs, And I'm really thankful that I'm a licensed psychologist because I was trained in theology and history before that, but that was one of the great things about having my position is I got free education, and every summer I would get free education and at Claremont, and I really got the best degrees from the best universities, and it was a great opportunity for me. And so the psychobiography is something that I wrote thinking I would never write another book on Adventism again, because when I left the church in 2010, I was completely burned out on Adventism. I was sick of them, sick of their lies, sick of their dishonesty, sick of their unwillingness to repent, sick of their unwillingness to change. And my congregation was as well. And so I was planning on I had already written 9 books on Ellen White and Adventism, had no desire to ever write anything to do with Adventism again. And then the White Estate got hacked in 2012 by an Australian group. And initially they tried to blackmail the church because they had all this dirt on Ellen White. An insider had helped them hack the whole thing, which included stuff from her diaries and things that they had withheld from us as researchers, which really made me angry when I came to realize that this stuff started appearing on the internet. And I realized, holy Toledo, they withheld all this stuff from us as researchers, which was not supposed to happen. And what they did when they wouldn't pay this group off was the group started leaking stuff onto the internet. So the White Estate said, oh man, we're going to be screwed. So what can we do? So their strategy was, hey, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of Ellen's death next year. So in honor of that and to show our great openness, let's start putting all this stuff out on the internet ourselves so we can take credit for putting it out there. So that's the way they tried to undermine these hackers. And so then everything became out there. And once I started reading all this stuff, I was saying, holy Toledo, how disgusting can these people be? And, especially stuff from her diaries, especially stuff from her being an alcoholic. I mean, she was, she was the most teetotaling. One drop of alcohol sends you straight to hell for even for medicinal purposes. I mean, she was like the most condemning person of alcohol on the planet. And here she was, a complete alcoholic herself, almost died of alcohol withdrawals. And so I said, holy Toledo, I got to restudy some of this stuff now that this has been exposed. So that's what led me to ask the research question, will all the accusations of fraud and pathology that have been leveled against Ellen White throughout her lifetime and throughout the years since her death, will those stand up to historical and psychological scrutiny? So that was my research question that I was focusing on, and I certainly found an answer to that research question. Absolutely, this stuff will stand up in ways that Adventists never dreamed, and so it was a fascinating book. As a psychologist and historian, I was just, and I'd been teaching Adventist history for years, but what people don't understand is until you specifically research something, you typically have a more superficial understanding of it. If you do a PhD on it or something, then that's a little different. You're much more informed about that particular area. And now I became much more informed about all the critics of Ellen White, all the stuff that had been hidden. And I knew about a fair amount of it, which I was teaching in my classes for those years. But now I discovered, the alcoholism and all this other stuff. And that was really the essence of what I published in the psychobiography was in addition to looking at how Ellen was just such a classic narcissistic personality, how the historical evidence lines up with that 100%, how she was a high functioning sociopath, which is a lot more serious even than being a narcissist. I mean, she was just plain evil and how she destroyed people who questioned her. But she had a lot to hide. I mean, most Adventists don't have any clue about the origins of Adventism. All that stuff's been hidden. It's been lied. F.D. Nickel lied to them about the shut door and all this kind of stuff. But as a psychologist, I had the opportunity to go back and study Ellen White's life from its inception. And that's something that had never been done in a way that was open and honest. There was all this hagiography written about her, but there was never anything that dealt with the problems and the tragedy of her life, really. And so now I was the first one to really write about this from a holistic perspective, looking at her whole lifetime. And, what Adventists often, even the scholars don't understand that, hey, this woman was pathological before she got hit in the head with a rock. That happened at the age of 9. But there's this obvious pathology when she's 8 years old. She's suicidal. She wants to die. She's absolutely certain she's going to hell. She has all these ridiculous pathological fears of God. This wasn't Methodism. This wasn't her family. This wasn't her other seven siblings. She's getting this from some other source, most likely a demonic source. I believe she was impacted by the spiritual realm in a very dark side, negative side, even before she had her accident. I believe she was handpicked by the devil, if you will, to be this person this deceiver that she became. And I don't go into that in the psychobiography because I'm writing from a historical psychological perspective. So I don't bring up the demonic stuff. I do more in my last book. But this stuff is really significant because this woman has the most fear-based mentality you can imagine before she has the rock accident. And then when she gets the rock accident on top of it, again, that's very misunderstood. A lot of Adventists have tried to say, oh, that was the source of her visions, complex partial seizures, and all this kind of stuff. I don't buy that at all. I've studied the injury in great detail. And what happened was a friend of hers that she'd had a big fight with, she was a pretty antagonistic person, even as a kid, I think. But anyway, this girl was so angry at her that she yelled at her and threw a big rock. And when Ellen turned around, the rock hit her right in the top of the nose and grossly broke her nose. I'm sure she got a concussion, but it did not cause brain damage, as Adventists often teach and believe. She just kept walking with her sister and walking unaided until the swelling from that rock injury went into her brain. Then she went into a coma that lasted for quite some time, several days. There's some argument about exactly how long, but up to 2, even 3 weeks that she was in this coma. They all thought she was going to die. And this is when the swelling was impacting her brain. Once the swelling reduced again and was no longer impacting her brain, she had a normal brain again. There wasn't any permanent brain injury that occurred to her. There was only temporary brain injury from the swelling. And that's what Adventists need to understand. But she took a huge advantage of that injury. And this is where you see from a very young age that this is a highly manipulative young girl. Not only is she a very fearful young girl, but she comes to realize, hey, I'm getting all this attention now. She was the youngest of 8 kids with her twin sister. And, this was a day and age of the first they were living on a farm, all kinds of chores, all kinds of work. Her dad then moved to the city and became a hatter. But that was after, her injury occurred shortly after they moved. And so Ellen really got out of all her childhood chores, all the female roles that were expected of young girls growing up, doing the dishes, all this kind of stuff. She escaped all that and she became the center of family concern, sympathy. Is she going to die? First, they all thought she was going to die. Oh, she made it. Like it was a miraculous survival. And medical care was pretty poor back then. So in many ways, she was fortunate. I don't know if the devil played a role in her recovery or not. But anyway, they tried to send her back to school. And she should have been able to go back to school because she didn't have any kind of brain damage. She did start to really use her injury and her poor health as a result of the injury to her advantage. Like, anytime she was expected to do something like go back to school or something, no, I'm too weak, So this is what I call creative malady in the book, which is a well-known term in psychology. So she used her malady for her own personal benefit and was really able to become her own person, making her own decisions, doing what she wanted to do, being the center of family attention. And it's shortly after this that she starts really thinking in the spiritual realm and becomes converted at a Shouting Methodist camp meeting. And most people don't have any appreciation for the difference between a regular Methodist church, like the Chestnut Methodist Church that her parents belonged to, and the Shouting Methodist camp meetings. There is a ridiculously huge difference. And the camp meetings were absolutely pathological. anyone who studies this stuff in detail will find that the camp meetings were the most fanatical assemblies you could possibly find. And they had what they called rings. And these rings shouted and screamed, shouted at the devils, screamed down the Holy Spirit. They believed no one could be converted except by a ring. And whichever ring screamed and shouted the most, it was the one that could convert people. And the speakers would, Asbury, these famous Methodists, would come to speak there. They'd all be shouted down by the rings. The ringleaders told them, your preaching doesn't matter. No one gets converted by preaching. It's only by the shouting and screaming that anyone gets converted. And the shouting and screaming was just the beginning of it. They had all kinds of animal sounds, crawling. Just openly ridiculous stuff that accompanied these rings. And Ellen became a well-known person who got prominence even as a young teenager in the shouting Methodist movement because she was claiming to have all these visions. So her visionary stuff starts when she's in the shouting Methodists. And then she gets kicked out of the Methodist church because her and her parents are leaving the meetings of the Methodists and going to the Millerite meetings. Then they're coming back and trying to pull people out of their Chestnut church into Millerism. And by this time, Millerism has become really fanatical. When Millerism started, it was trying to be interdenominational. It was trying not to be critical of the denominations. But it became more and more criticized by the denominations for its date setting. And there were a whole bunch of dates they set in 1843. It wasn't just one. There were several of them. I just mentioned one in the psychobiography. I go into more detail in my more recent books. But anyway, there were a whole bunch of dates there that they were messing with. But the big date became October 22, 1844. That's the one that they put all their chips on. And anyway, as they got closer to that date, they became more and more dogmatic, more and more condemning of all the other churches. They're all Babylon. They're all completely denounced. And that's what the Methodist Church objected to with the whites, is that they were denouncing Methodism and these other churches in favor of Millerism. And so it explicitly says in the documents that disfellowshipped the whites that it was for false date setting and divisively trying to pull members out of the church. That's what they were kicked out for. But Ellen White completely lies about it when she describes it and says, oh, they kicked us out for our belief in the second coming, which was a total lie because all the Methodists believed in the second coming. They just didn't believe in the gross date setting or the divisive anti-denominationalism. So it's really interesting to see how this young girl is so willing to lie about this stuff, just high-handedly lie. For a young teenager to be willing to do that, it's pretty distressing. But then she goes into Millerism because she's kicked out of Methodism. And this was a very interesting thing to me. And I've been evolving in my study of Millerism as far as the charismatic dimensions of Millerism since I wrote the psychobiography. And there have been some other real good books written on this subject. And so what happened was, even though Miller was very anti-charismatic, he came out of the Masons and he was anything but a charismatic. Him and the other Millerite leaders completely denounced and condemned charismatic Christianity. So I was always thinking before when I wrote the psychobiography, well, she couldn't have been all that influential in Millerism because here she was, this weirdo charismatic visionary, and they denounced that stuff. But what I discovered was there was a pocket of Millerism in Portland, Maine that was extremely charismatic. And I knew, of course, that Ellen had this connection with Damon, who was arrested, but I didn't realize how heavily he was involved in Millerism himself when I wrote the psychobiography. But he was heavily involved in it, and there were a whole bunch of charismatic Millerites in Portland, Maine, who gave Ellen great prominence because of her visions. And so she was claiming to have all these visions that confirmed the date setting of Millerism. And she was confirming the wrong dates in 1843. Then she confirmed the wrong date in 1844 through, again, a whole bunch of visions, and gained great prominence again as a young teenager. She's only in her mid-teens, and this is in an age when women don't get traction in ministry. So, she really has a ridiculous amount of influence in this movement in Portland, Maine, and they elevate her up to high positions in this movement simply because of her visionary claims. So all that happens before Ellen even has her first vision after the Great Disappointment, which is what's considered her first vision in the Adventist movement. This is what would become the Seventh Day Adventist movement, which was at the age of 17 in December of 1844 that she had that. But this is when the stuff really gets ridiculous as far as Adventist origins are concerned, because William Miller, the Millerites in general, they recognized, hey, we missed the boat. We were wrong. They admitted they were wrong. They repented of being wrong. But except for this one group of Millerites who couldn't admit they were wrong, and that's what would become the Advent movement. It can never admit it's wrong. That's so typical of Adventism. It's just ridiculous. But that was the case after the Great Disappointment. No, we weren't wrong. The date was right. The event was wrong. It wasn't actually the second coming. It was the close of probation. So probation closed on that date. In effect, no one can be saved after that date. If you didn't accept the Millerite message as we have, you're lost. So that's what
Can you
they're
say a little bit more about that, Steve? Because this is the shut door doctrine. Can you explain that? Because this is an extremely important topic that Ellen tried to suppress with another vision,
right.
and the Adventist Church today has revised that whole story. Can you maybe say a little
Absolutely.
bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff on this, and I go into detail in both the psychobiography and my last book called The White Estate Fraud, which exposes modern day fraud and Adventism at a level that's unbelievable, where the White Estate and Ellen's grandson Arthur White is concerned. But this shut door thing is so important because that's where Ellen put all of her eggs. All her eggs were put in the shut door basket. And what Adventists try to say was, well, yeah, initially Ellen White believed in the shut door, and Miller even initially believed it, but he got away from it very quickly and then condemned all the Sabbatarian Adventist nonsense in 1845. But Ellen, later on writes, oh, I did initially believe that, but then God gave me the vision to show me that wasn't true. It's the exact opposite of what happened. It was her vision in December of 1844 that cemented the shut door doctrine in the minds of Adventists. And again, this vision had nothing to do with God. None of Ellen's visions had anything to do with God. They were all taken from other people and attributed to God. And the person she stole her 1844 vision from was Joseph Turner. He'd written a big paper about the shut door. Ellen's father had it in their home. Ellen had total access to it. She denies having read it, but Turner tells her after she gives this first vision, hey, that's identical to what I have in my paper, you know. So she's completely plagiarizing his paper and attributing it to God in this first Adventist vision. And in that, she says, God showed me or us the specific day and hour of his coming. And then the whole vision is about this narrow path that they're all climbing up. And only those who stay on this path can be saved. And that's the ones that accept the shut door, that the whole wicked world is lost. And she says that right in the vision. The whole wicked world is lost. Everyone who hasn't accepted the Millerite thing is lost. And so the shut door is now the doctrine that Adventists latch onto more than any other doctrine. The next year, 1845, they get the Seventh-day Sabbath from the Seventh-day Baptists. And then again, Ellen claims it came from God. So Adventists always attribute it to God rather than giving credit to the true source, which were the Seventh-day Baptists. But, the bottom line is that every year Ellen White is emphasizing this shut door thing. But it really has 3 stages. That's something that's very important for people to understand. The initial stage is, if you didn't accept the Millerite message, you are lost for eternity. The door of probation's been closed. No one can be saved except our little group. I mean, it's as myopic as you can possibly get, because it was only about 150 people that were in their little group. So the whole rest of the world is lost, except this little group of 150 people. And Ellen's just insistent on this, and she's confirming this and making this the doctrine based on claimed visions from God. So it starts in December of 1844, and she keeps having these visions. And people are asking her in 1845, okay, God told you the day or the hour, so when is it? Well, it's a little bit hazy, but he's shown me, he sent me the angelic messenger to tell me that he will return before the end of May. So they all get their, date set. Linda Burdick is a close friend of Ellen who travels with her and everything. So she describes all this stuff that Ellen said in the churches, and she heard firsthand traveling with Ellen. And, she's saying people are coming up to her and say, when's this going to happen? Well, the angel showed me it's going to happen by the end of May. So they're all dead set on he's going to return by the end of May, 1845. Of course, May comes and goes. So the people come back to her again. What happened? How come he didn't come back by the last day of May? Well, the angel spoke to me in the language of Canaan, and I didn't understand it fully. Now I recognize that language is telling me that he's coming by the end of September. So that's the next big month that they all focus on. He will be there by September 30. The Lord will return for sure by the end of September. Well, of course, he doesn't come again. And so there are people leaving and stuff that are just fed up, And so this is a very small group, and Ellen's manipulating them all for money. She goes from one house church to the next. Linda tells how she says, the Lord has shown me we're really going to be persecuted on this trip, and we're going to need all the support we can get, including financial support, because we don't have any money. So she gets all this financial support, and then they take this big trip, and they come back, and the next time they meet with the house church. So did you get put in prison like the vision showed, and did you get persecuted? Oh, no, we had a great time. So, she's not even smart enough to lie about it. But at that point, Linda Burdick said she was out of there. She couldn't take it anymore. That Ellen was just making up stuff, whatever she needed to make up to get money from people, which was really her MO. And her and James were as poor as, street mice. They were just absolutely poverty stricken when they got married. Neither one of them had any money to their name at all. And the funny thing was, before they got married, they were teaching in their little group of leaders that they published in the church paper. It wasn't an organized church at that time. They published in their movement paper that it was a sin to get married because it showed a lack of faith. So they forbade marriage, as Paul talks about in Timothy. And one couple that defied them and got married, they kicked out of Adventism because they got married. So they were enforcing this and showing no mercy on anyone who defied them. But then everyone starts accusing them of immorality because they're traveling together, unmarried, unchaperoned, male and female, which in that day did not go over well. So James gives Ellen an ultimatum and says, either you marry me or I have to quit traveling with you. So it was hardly a romantic marriage. It was a marriage out of shotgun necessity, if you will. And so they get married, even though they're completely defying what they had, insisted on and disciplined people for doing before them. But now it was okay because they were doing it. And I mean, the hypocrisy and stupidity of this early movement is as fanatical as you can possibly get. And if you know anything about Israel Damon, in 1845, Ellen White was his right-hand man, right-hand woman, having all these prophecies in his meetings. This guy's this most fanatical, charismatic Millerite that you can possibly find. Every bit as bad as anything as we find in the shouting Methodist group. He gets arrested. He gets put in prison. Ellen White describes this stuff in completely false ways, where all the witnesses, sheriffs, everyone else describes it in a complete opposite way of how she acts like God intervenes and keeps him from getting arrested. I mean, it's just complete nonsense. But the next thing that's really funny is Ellen, people are starting to catch on. Hey, we're not giving these morons any more money. They're just sucking us dry. And so James and Ellen, the jig is up for them. They're running out of money and they don't know what to do next. And so they come up with this plan that we need to get someone who's wealthy and will support us, and that was really mature and has some influence beyond ours because they're very young. And so they decided it's Captain Bates. He's a retired ship captain, a very influential man, very mature man, has high respect. Adventists always try to say he gave away all of his wealth in the Great Disappointment, which is a total lie. He did sell some property, but he was still a very wealthy man in the early Adventist movement. And Ellen and James come up with this great plan where his hobby is astronomy. Most ship captains knew astronomy well anyway, but he was just obsessed with astronomy, written a whole book on astronomy. So Ellen and James come up with this plan. Hey, we'll read all about this. Then we'll make sure that you have a vision at one of the house churches when he's there on astronomy. And God shows you all this stuff when you don't know anything about astronomy.
And this is Joseph Bates, right, Steve? Joseph Bates?
Joseph Bates, right.
Okay.
So anyway, they get him invited to this house church. They know he's going to be there. Ellen is thoroughly, educated by James and has read this book. She knows Bates' stuff in and back and forward. So she very cleverly goes into this big vision where she's flying through space in this meeting where Bates is, and she starts describing all this astronomical stuff out of his book. And Bates says, "Oh, I can't believe this." He looks over at James. "Has she ever read anything on astronomy?" "Not a thing. She's never known anything about astronomy. This is all from God." So she's, throwing out all this incredible stuff from his book that he just, and before this, he didn't believe in the visions. He was very skeptical about the visions. So that was the whole goal of this meeting, was for them to betray or, basically just completely deceive him about the visions. And it was completely premeditated and deliberate. I mean, this Adventists try to deny all this stuff, but it's 100% obvious.
And if I'm not mistaken, Steve, she was kind of, acting like she was floating, like you said.
Right.
Which is very strange because they're very anti-charismatic, the Seventh Day Adventists today. But and then she starts talking about the moons of
Right.
Saturn.
Right. Absolutely.
Saturn. But to top it off, she also talked about the people who lived in Saturn.
Yes.
And that they were
Jupiter and Saturn is the way she puts it.
Yeah, and that they were the very tall people.
Right.
Which
Right.
is very interesting because Joseph Smith believed that the moon was inhabited.
Yes.
By people that look like Quakers. So every time we have Quaker oatmeal, I always think of Joseph Smith.
Yes.
And then Brigham Young thought the sun was inhabited as well.
The sun, yeah.
So the sun, so she claims that Jupiter and Saturn had these
Being
inhabitants that were tall people,
correct.
but she said that she mentioned the number of moons, and Bates was like, "Oh, that's Saturn, that's Jupiter."
Right, correct.
And yet, if it was from God, wouldn't you agree, Steve, that based on what we know about astronomy, that Jupiter and Saturn have many more moons than the ones
Yeah.
she suggested? Wouldn't God know that, and wouldn't
Oh,
God reveal
absolutely.
that to his prophet? Yeah.
And that's how we know this was completely fraudulent, because we know she was taking the stuff out of his book. She gives the exact number of moons for Jupiter and Saturn that he had in his book, which was the known number at that day. And now it's like 70 moons of Saturn compared to 4, that she spoke of. And the reason she throws in these tall beings thing, which she did steal a lot of stuff from Mormonism as well, which is quite interesting. A lot of stuff written on that. But the reason she throws in this being stuff is because she wants to convince Bates of something that can't be proven otherwise. Oh, God's showing me these beings, and they had no way of knowing better. Now
Unfalsifiable.
yeah, we know nowadays that there are no beings on Saturn or Jupiter, but Bates didn't know that, and there wasn't scientific evidence enough to know that. So she throws this in to help Bates hear all this stuff that he knows is true, and now she's throwing this in to convince him with something supernatural that he couldn't possibly disprove. And so it was just a complete frame job, and she was totally successful. Bates is like jumping out of his chair, naming all these planets that she's describing. It was just a perfect hoax and con job. And James and Ellen, I'm sure, were just thrilled. And James writes up a big article immediately after this meeting, talking about how Brother Bates was converted to the truth of the visions and all this stuff. And the three of them then become the co-founders of Adventism. And I bring this up because Bates wrote this book. It was a booklet on the 7-year theory, which Ellen adopts. And the 7-year theory was that the actual date when Jesus is going to return is October 22, 1851. So there's going to be the 7-year period. He explains why it has to be 7 years. He's all in on the shut door. Ellen gets the shut door from Bates and James. She never comes up with anything original herself. Everything she ever claimed to get in vision can always be traced to a person, a book, a source she stole it from. Um, but she was always trying to please Bates and James. And they both came out of what was called the Christian Connection movement, which was a total cult. They didn't believe Jesus was God. They hated the doctrine of the Trinity and mocked and ridiculed it. They just didn't even believe in basic Orthodox Christianity. They were absolute extreme perfectionists. So this is what Ellen is echoing from them during these years, and along with the shut door. And she specifically keeps emphasizing the shut door right up until shortly before October 22, 1851. And she gives these specific statements that are, again, the equivalent of showing that she adopted or accepted the 7-year theory. Like, she believed that the close of probation was going to be approximately 1 year, and that would be the time of trouble. And all the Adventists themselves. Let me go back to the shut door again. Her initial teaching was, if you didn't accept the Millerite movement, you are lost. Period. Period. But after about 2, 3, 4 years, people are coming and asking, who are you guys? What are you doing? What's going on? Oh, we believed in the Millerite movement. Oh, who was Miller? These are people who hadn't even heard of Miller. So Ellen has to revise her visions now, that it's only those who rejected the Millerite movement that were lost. If you never heard of it, you can accept what they're saying now, and the door of mercy is not shut. So that's a second version of the shut door that creeps in around 3 years into the 7-year period. But then she gets into this 7-year thing that Bates writes in 1848. And now she's saying specific dates again. Like in the summer of 1850, she's saying there's only 3 months left before probation closes and the time of trouble begins, and there won't be any opportunity for anyone. What they were telling the newbies who came into the movement was your probation hasn't closed yet because you hadn't heard all this stuff. So we're teaching you all this stuff. And as long as you accept it, you won't be lost. But otherwise, everyone's lost. And so now she's telling these newbies, you've got 3 months left before the time of trouble comes. This is the summer of 1850. So it fits perfectly. You got 3 months left till October 22, 1850, 3 months till October 22, 1850. And then you're going to have the year of the time of trouble, and probation's closed for everyone, including all the Adventists. So, she obviously accepts this Joseph Bates 7-year theory. James was a little bit more skeptical about it because I guess he'd maybe learned a little more about their stupid date setting stuff. But anyway, once you get to the summer, Adventists love to point to a statement she makes in the summer of 1851, late summer. It's August, shortly before. What happens here is that Ellen realizes she's dead wrong. She realizes, hey, there was no time of trouble. All this stuff you claim to see in visions, a total lie. There's no evidence that any of it has happened. So she's thinking, I better start backpedaling pretty quick. So at that point, she makes a statement about it being wrong to set dates. And Adventists love to cling to that. Oh, she didn't believe in the 1851 theory because of this one statement. No, it's a complete attempt on her part to backpedal because she knows she's been proven wrong. Everything she said's been proven wrong. And she knows nothing's going to change in the next few months. So she basically quits believing in the 7-year theory just a few months before October 22, 1851 comes. But the statement she makes about the shut door before then, even as late as 1849, 1850, early 1851, if you reject this, you've committed the unpardonable sin. If you reject our teaching of the shut door, you're of the devil. I mean, she's just straight out, this is something you can't possibly not believe, or the Holy Spirit cannot be in your life. I mean, it's unbelievable the statement she makes about the shut door doctrine, even as late as 49, 50, and 51. And she's telling all the believers in 49 that they need to sell their houses, their properties, all their possessions, except the most minimal things to live on, and give all that money to the cause, which her and James totally controlled. And they go and they buy a house with that money, their first house. But, here are these people, and I'm sure it wasn't a huge number, but there were definitely a number of people who obeyed her visions, sold their houses and property and possessions, and had nothing because she insisted that probation was closing. And then, of course, none of that ever happened. These people lost all their stuff. She didn't make any refunds. She took the money herself, and her and James became wealthy. That was really the beginning of their wealth, along with what Joseph Bates had shared with them. And the whole rest of their life, they are just pulling major financial cons. I mean, every church they go to, they're selling hymnals, they're selling all their trinkets, their charts, their dress patterns, all the stuff she tells people they have to buy from visions. They made more than $1 million in our money just from selling hymnals. They should have never made a cent off those hymnals. They didn't write those hymnals. They were just taking hymnals that they got from other places and selling them for a large amount to Adventist church members. I mean, it was gross exploitation. And this follows the pattern the whole rest of their life. They scam the Adventist people in a ton of different ways. They buy at least 10 houses that we know of, many of them mansions. They live the most luxurious. Ellen has a staff of over 20 people most of the last couple decades of her life, actually the last 35 years of her life after James dies. She has an entourage, even that she takes with her to Australia. It's 21 in number when she's at Elmshaven. But, cooks, laundry, every possible need she has. She has staff living on this huge plantation.
Wow.
It's so ridiculous. I mean, she's every bit as bad as the worst TV evangelist you can find today.
Right. Well, today, Steve, when you see a lot of these Adventists, when they come from other countries to visit Michigan, they go to, of course, her very humble beginnings. This
Right.
little house that looks like a shed. And
Yeah.
they talk about how humble she was and how simple she was. They never show her mansions for some strange reason.
Yeah. I mean, she had a huge 16-room Italian mansion in that same city that burned down after she sold it. It's really interesting to study the fires that occurred in Adventist history. Many of them were very peculiar. But she made a fortune off her writings, at least 3 million in book royalties in our money today, a minimum of that. She still drew a full salary. She still got all this money from peddling at all the churches, all their wares. Her and James came up with a whole bunch of plans that just grossly exploited the church members. I mean, it's a travesty to see the way Adventists misrepresent who she was. She died millions in our money today in debt, even though she lived high on the hog and the most lavish thing. Of course, when you have a staff of 21 people, she didn't really care about how she spent money because she knew she had the church bent over. She knew that when she died, she'd be turning all these books over to the church so she could run into debt as much as she wanted. And despite her and James ripping off the church for years and years and years, they still died. Ellen still died in major debt. And it's just atrocious. She told church members not to make up wills for their family, but to give it all to the church. She did the exact opposite. She gave as much to her family as she could, saddled the church with as much debt as she possibly could. I mean, she just did the exact opposite of what her visions were in every area. I don't care if it's plagiarism. She lies about everything. She denies everything. The woman is a scoundrel.
Yeah.
I mean,
So, can you say a little bit, Steve, about the fact that Ellen White forbade her followers from eating meat, but yet she had hunks of beef.
oh yeah,
They also ate food that she said, unclean foods. That like she loved oysters. Apparently, she was caught eating oysters,
yeah,
and also apparently pork as well. So here's another example of telling others not to eat meats,
right.
especially unclean meats.
And even dairy products.
Yes, dairy products. So can you say a
Followed
little
what
bit about
she
that?
said, if you followed what she said, you'd have to be a vegan vegetarian because no eggs, no butter, no cream, no milk. Dairy products are out, so you have to be a complete vegan if you really want to be translated. If you really want to be saved, meats. You know, she's absolutely condemning of all meat in many, many places, but especially unclean meats. When I was growing up in Adventism, if anyone even considered eating a piece of pork or what was considered unclean meat, oysters or anything like that, you might as well just get on a train straight to hell because you're going to hell with absolute certainty. And yet we know she was oinking down the oysters like mad secretly behind veils and restaurants. the woman, James, writes a letter that says, we just downed a 63 porker, 63-pound porker in their own home, when she's telling everyone else they can't eat meat or dairy products. And she had every form of dairy products. I mean, she was the biggest hypocrite in the world when it came to diet. Everything. I mean, there's a great book out called The Spirit of Hypocrisy that's just recently been written that just shows Ellen being the biggest hypocrite you could possibly be on virtually everything she writes about. And that was absolutely true. I mean, the woman was just, like I say, a scoundrel. It's amazing how it's all about cover up. After the 1851 date passed, James and Ellen went in and they edited out everything about the shut door, all the stuff that proved she was a fanatical liar, that her visions were 100% false. They removed all that stuff with no notations, no acknowledgement. Just suddenly these publications appeared with all this stuff deleted from them. This is just the dishonesty of Ellen White and the Adventist leadership that's followed her. They lie, they cover up, they go to any extreme. Like this Kevin guy, he's followed F.D. Nichols' footsteps, which F.D. Nichol was a very bright guy. He was a very smart guy, and he basically convinced the whole Adventist church that he could refute any criticism ever made against Ellen White. So this, Ellen White and Her Critics is a huge book. He's got several other books that are apologetic for Ellen White. And Kevin is just echoing his arguments. He doesn't know what he's talking about, Kevin Morgan. It's sad, but he tries to act like he's a scholar or an academic. But I've already proven that F.D. Nichol was a deliberate liar. What he said about the shut door was taking Ellen White's much later statements, 1883, 1874, and acting like that's what she really said about the shut door, when they were the exact opposite of what she said during that 7-year period. And, Morgan tries to buy into that. Come on, you're irresponsible as a historian to take her lies in 1884 or 1883 and 1874 when the source documentation proves they were absolute lies.
Right.
Just to the most extreme. And she's saying the most extreme stuff about the shut door.
Right. It's interesting. You were mentioning that, even the whole health reform was plagiarized as well. Her whole
absolutely, yeah.
views. And I was just thinking, a brother in Christ whom we both know, who's a former Adventist, he shared with me how being raised Adventist and being on that strict diet, he was severely malnourished as a young boy. Yeah. And even today, he still has the ill effects of that deficiency. He still suffers from it today. And so here's Ellen White, taking down, oysters and eating beef and pork and so forth. And her followers are languishing, in some cases, with malnutrition.
Absolutely. And it's that way about everything. My mom, when I was born, was very, very young, and she looked like she was 15. She was a 20-year-old, 21 when I was born, but she couldn't wear a wedding ring. That was, even in Southern California at that time, you couldn't wear a wedding ring or you were disfellowshipped from the church. And she had a job working as a secretary in the denomination. So she was going to lose her job if she ever wore a wedding ring. And she couldn't even wear it in public. She couldn't even wear it when she was away from work. So she was always getting hit on by all these people. She was always getting all these dirty looks when she's 8 months pregnant with me, sticking out because she was just a skinny kid and very, very thin woman. And so the pregnancy showed like mad. And she's walking around without a wedding ring. So everyone's degrading her and making all these slut comments. And all these guys are hitting on her because she was a very attractive woman. And all because of the stupid Ellen White stuff about wedding bands. Even you can't even wear a simple wedding band that's not even jewelry. I mean,
And yet, Ellen White, in a number of her pictures, she's wearing a brooch,
oh
uh,
yeah,
wearing a necklace.
she had a huge jewelry collection herself. This is just typical of her. Same thing with fancy hats. Everything she condemns, her wardrobe, it was all just grossly hypocritical. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously the woman didn't believe in God, and she's just making these visions up. She's just taking them from the health reformers, like Numbers showed in his book. He wrote Prophetess of Health in 1976. And that was really kind of the beginning of the new research that showed scholarly that Ellen was a plagiarist. She was a liar. She did cover stuff up. She did deliberately lie about plagiarizing, denying it. Um, that book really impacted me a lot. And, I read that the year it came out, the very month it came out, and the conference president forbade any of us to read it at the next workers meeting. Thankfully, I'd already read it. But, it's just unbelievable how much research and how many formers there are. In the book I'm writing right now, which is called Leaving Adventism, in chapter 17, and I'm partially indebted to your Dr. James White that I noticed wrote the foreword to your book. He's a neat guy, but he did some really great research on the lies that Adventists tell about their numbers. And I went beyond that and researched it, not only using his stuff, but all kinds of other sources. And I concluded that while Adventists claim to have 24 million members today, I can document and show statistically and through verified, source documentation that number is about 3 million. So it's about 1/7, 1/8 of what they claim versus, again, they're just so misrepresentative. The Mormons are at least honest. Generally speaking, the Mormons are a lot more honest as a people than what Adventists are. Adventists will lie through their teeth like Kevin Morgan and
Hmm.
not.
So Steve, let's talk a little bit about her plagiarism, because it's people like Walter Rea and others have published books like The White Lie,
Yes.
and it is so painfully obvious that Ellen White plagiarized Alfred Edersheim, the author of
Yeah.
Jesus, the Messiah, and so forth,
Correct.
The Life and Times of Jesus, the Messiah, and also Milton's
Yeah.
Paradise Lost,
A whole bunch of books. Yeah.
and there's, I mean, her Desire of the Ages, her Great Controversy.
And yeah, you can just go right down the line. And now, in this day and age of computers, we can just go back and find almost every single. Well, it's like Veltman said. Veltman was hired by the church to look into the whole Ellen White thing from Desire of Ages after Ray wrote his book. And Veltman's own conclusions, paid by the church to do this, one of their own professors, was that her works are derivative. They come from others. They are not original. They do not come from God, and they do not come from any original thinking on her part. They are derivative. And he says, in my research, I could only find about 31% that was absolutely word for word. But that's the whole point of Ellen. She was deliberately dishonest. A typical day for Ellen would be she gets up early, she goes to her study, which contains a ton of books, both Adventist and non Adventist. She claims to be praying and receiving visions when she's going through these other books like mad. And she's copying, but she's deliberately trying to hide the copying in the manuscripts that she's going to give to her assistants. And she had great assistants. Fanny Bolton was a very gifted journalist and writer, and so was Marion Davis. Um, but she deliberately deceived them and gave them these very messy manuscripts with no references, no sources, very occasionally quotation marks with no reference given. Um, so she's really deliberately deceiving her own assistants and hanging them out to dry because they can easily get prosecuted for, and that's what she was thinking. If there's any problem with plagiarism, they're going to take the fall, not me. That's the way she set it up. But she deliberately deceived them, and it was only because they were very bright people that they came to discover increasingly more and more plagiarism to the point where it destroyed both of them. Both of those women were destroyed by Ellen White in their 50s. So, Ellen would make these stupid comments. Marion's going to be the death of me because she's always asking all these stupid questions about plagiarism. Well, she was the death of both of those assistants. She caused very early deaths, and in Fanny's case, she went insane in her 50s. She actually went insane and had to go to an asylum. And it was all on Ellen White. I mean, the woman was just atrocious, even to those people that were most dedicated to her, most loyal to her. She destroyed so many lives of people that worshiped the ground she walked on, if they even ask a question. I mean, this woman is just evil personified, and I wish it wasn't true. I grew up thinking, of course, that she was a prophet of God when I was a kid and stuff. But I mean, it's just overwhelming to see how bad she was.
Yeah.
Even when I was teaching SDA history, I didn't have a clue as to how evil, I mean, deliberately evil she was until I wrote the psychobiography.
So Steve, when they say things like, "Oh, well, back in those days, that was permissible, to take other people's works," but there was a lawsuit filed against the Seventh Day Adventists by Coney Bear, I believe, in
Yeah,
Hauser.
Connie Barrenhausen, yeah.
Yeah. So
That
if it was permissible, why was there a lawsuit filed, and why did they immediately, backpedal?
withdraw the book, yeah. It was sketches of the life of
Yeah.
Paul, and that
Yeah.
was just completely plagiarized, no question about it.
Right.
And they did take it off the market immediately when they got the lawsuit threat.
Is that the book here? The
Yes,
Life and Epistle of St. Paul, yeah, by
right.
Coney Bear, Hausen and Coney Bear. So she plagiarized out of this book as well.
Correct.
Right.
And as soon as the copyright expired on that, they reissued the book under Ellen's name. Uh, and the other thing is, even way back in the 1860s, the Review and Herald and the Adventist publications were saying, "Don't you dare take our material and publish it under your name without giving us credit." They were very conscious of copyright. Ellen White copyrighted all her books and insisted on the highest royalties. Um, so they knew very well what copyright was, and they were very condemning of anyone who dared to violate it where their materials were concerned. But then they try to turn around and say, "Oh, it was nothing. Everybody did it." It's a ridiculous lie. And
Isn't there a hypocrisy here, Steve, in the sense that, the fourth commandment is basically, this is the commandment par excellence. It's the one that you saw in the vision that had a ring of light around it.
right,
And yet, bearing false witness, James says to break one commandment is to break all of them.
yeah,
So bearing false witness was okay with Ellen White. And also the strange fact that Seventh-day Adventist hospitals perform abortions, which
absolutely,
violates the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder.
yeah,
So how is it okay to break the sixth commandment, break the ninth commandment in terms of Ellen White's plagiarism, but don't you dare break the fourth commandment? That is the seal of God. The hypocrisy that continues today.
it's stupidity, and none of them keep the Sabbath anyway. It, when I was growing up, there was much more of an attempt to be legalistic and rigid about the Sabbath. But now they've pretty much all thrown that in the trash, especially in Southern California. But I mean, the whole commandment thing is a joke anyway. They don't understand the new covenant. They don't understand the old covenant. They don't understand that the word commandment isn't even used in the Hebrew with reference to the 10. Um, that Hebrew word applies to the 613 commands
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
Hebrew. It's never used regarding the 10.
Right.
10 are considered summary sayings, summary statements. And, they're just so ignorant about stuff that it's really tragic. And so you see why they have to lie and cover up and run in the most ridiculous trains of deceit, because they don't have an argument to stand on. Every single thing that you would talk to them about, you can just make a mockery of what they argue. And it's really sad,
Yeah.
and that's why they like to stay so isolated, because they don't want interaction with the outer world. The last book I wrote on the white estate fraud, they don't even want to mention it, because they know how the psychobiography screwed them when they wrote a critical review in Spectrum, and they did an interview with me on Adventist Today, which then they tried to take down and get rid of the chairman of the board who did the interview. But now their strategy is don't even mention Daly, don't even mention his books, because they can't even come close to. This last book I wrote is cutting edge research that's never been talked about before, and exposes Arthur White as a complete, absolute fraud who not only fabricated a book that was filled with lies about D.M. Canwright, but did it secretly and ghost wrote it for Carrie Johnson, who Adventists lift up as this great, wonderful woman who was Canwright's secretary. And I show in the book that not only was she not Canwright's secretary, she never met Canwright. And it's absolutely proven in the book
Wow.
that she never met Canwright. And yet her and Arthur White fabricated this whole book over 20 years. And Adventists have made that, along with F.D. Nickel, the two books that refute Canwright and all the Adventist critics. I mean, these people are just disgustingly dishonest.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Steve, before I want to let everyone know, our viewers, we will take some questions from you. There will be a Q&A. If you're okay with that, Steve?
Yeah, I can go till about 6:30.
Okay, no problem. We're almost done.
Okay.
If you have any questions, folks, please put a Q in the chat, capital Q, and put your question down, and then we'll get Dr. Daly or myself to respond to them. And just one more thing, Steve. Let's talk about the amalgamation
Yeah.
idea that Ellen White taught about a mixture between man and beast.
Yes.
And the reason why I say this is much like with the Mormons, with their idea that the blacks were forbidden for priesthood until
Right.
1978,
Absolutely.
because they did not, they didn't choose a side in the premortal existence in with Heavenly Father and all that.
Right.
Because a lot of African Americans are Seventh Day Adventists.
Yes.
And in the Caribbean, I'm God willing, I'll be in Jamaica in November on a mission trip down there, and I know there's a lot of Seventh Day Adventists in Jamaica.
Good.
But let's talk about this, because I think a lot of our African American friends and brothers and sisters and viewers who may be African American, they may not know about this, but the story has been basically like the shut door. It's always revised. So
Right.
to make it sound like she didn't say what she said, but maybe
Absolutely.
you can mention that, Steve.
Yeah.
Let me take some questions.
Again, Ellen White drew from the Book of Jasher. She drew from Mormonism. This was a common belief, especially during the Civil War. This was right in the 1860s. It was a common belief, especially by racists in America, that African Americans, they were called Negroes then, but that they weren't fully human. They were only part human, and they were a mixture of man and beast, amalgamation of man and beast. So it was just this outrageous dehumanizing of blacks, basically. And Ellen was, again, she didn't have original thought in her body ever. She took this from other sources and just ignorantly went along with it because it made sense to her. So she's, again, just repeating arguments of stupidity from others. And this really backfired on her, because there were Adventists who were not racist and who were absolutely astounded and flabbergasted that she would write this kind of thing. So there was almost like a civil war in Adventism when she made these statements and said that, these races had been produced by this amalgamation of man and beast that were subhuman. And so Ellen was really in big trouble. People were just at their wits' end that she would write something like this and claim God showed it to her. And so Uriah Smith, who was actually a very bright guy, he still believed a lot of stupid things, but he was a very smart person, and he was generally an honest person. But anyway, he decides to try to rescue Ellen. He's the Review and Herald editor, and he's been that for about 10 years at this point. And so he writes this booklet, about a 68, 80-page booklet. I can't remember the exact number of pages. But anyway, what he tries to do is get Ellen off the hook by saying, well, yeah, she's certainly saying that these races are the product of amalgamation of man and beast. There's no question that she's saying that. But these are this certain Indian group, this certain group from New Guinea, this certain group from Africa. He tries to name these specific tribes, and he names 4 of them and says, she was only talking about these groups. These are the only ones that, and it didn't include like American blacks or American Negroes. So he was trying to get her off the hook with the big Civil War controversy by saying, oh, she was just talking about these isolated races, which is a joke. I mean, if you know anything about DNA, of course, which they didn't know at that time, but there would have been no way this would have been isolated to just 4 groups like this. And Ellen White never intended that when she wrote it. But her and James took Uriah Smith's book to camp meeting and peddled them like mad, again, making money for them and Smith. And James came out with a formal statement saying, yeah, this is precisely what Ellen meant, So that was the way they tried to get out of it. And it did get her off the hangman noose because she could have easily gone down over that. And yet it was still just a complete joke, Uriah Smith's. But most people didn't care. Once they said, oh, we're not talking about American Negroes, then a lot of people said, oh, well, forget it then. But the fact is she was talking about American Negroes when she wrote it. But once there was the explosion, she, of course, denied doing that. But then when F.D. Nickel comes along, he tries to claim that the statement had nothing to do with amalgamation between man and beast, period. Of course, by that time, it was known that humans and animals couldn't reproduce. So he's coming up with all this garbage that he's just making up off the top of his head. But it had nothing to do with what Ellen White was saying or writing. And it's just another classic example of this guy's gross dishonesty. He's very clever. He's kind of like a clever lawyer who can argue any case, and try to make people think he's right. And it sounds convincing, but if people know better, they can just expose his lies, which I've done in several cases. But
But Ellen White, I think, did say that, I think she mentioned that even after the flood, Noah's flood,
yes,
she was saying that there's still, you could still see
right.
the amalgamation. So
Right.
it wasn't a pre-flood,
Yeah, and Smith wasn't saying it was a pre-flood thing either.
Yeah.
They were both saying it was post-flood because she specifically said it was post-flood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, like, our African American friends that are watching, did you know that Ellen White, the one who Seventh Day Adventists prop up as the prophet of God, the mouthpiece of God, that she claimed that God told her that the black race was an amalgamation between man and beast. I mean, that is an insult to the image of God. God created all humans in his image. Acts 17, out of one man, one blood, God has made all the nations of the earth. And so, there's only one race, the human race. We're made of different ethnicities, different skin color, eye color, but we are all descended from Adam and made in the image of God. And
Absolutely.
so it's just horrific that she would even say such a thing.
Yeah,
Horrific.
it really is. It was completely racist. And even Smith's explanation was completely racist. But he did do damage control so that Ellen White didn't get thrown out, at least, which was what all they cared about.
Mhm.
But,
Yeah. So we'll take some questions, Steve.
yeah,
So just for sake of time, we have a question from James E. When I discovered this information, I think he's referring to I think it's your book.
uh,
But when I started to share with Adventist friends, they would not even watch or read the material. I think he may also be, James, I think you're also referring to the amalgamation theory. What is the psychology that keeps them afraid? I guess that means afraid to look at critical material of Ellen White.
Ellen White really covered herself in a lot of her prophecies about what would happen after her death, how the smartest people would turn against the testimonies. And, she warns this would be the final great deception, that people would turn against the testimonies. And if you get deceived by them, then you will be lost for eternity, she was threatening that for anything and everything, but especially for this. If anyone quit believing the testimonies, that was the most unpardonable sin.
Right.
And so, that comes up every single time any person criticizes Ellen White. Ron Numbers, I heard that when his book was published. I heard it when Ford protested Ellen. It was said at the 1919 Bible Conference when they spoke the truth about Ellen. Of course, it's said about me in my books. And Adventists are just trained not to. Ellen White even taught people it's a sin to read non-Adventist books and novels, especially. And yet she had a whole bunch of novels in her library, the typical hypocrisy. And she read all kinds of non-Adventist books that she was copying from, but she didn't really want other Adventists reading them.
Wow.
And the Adventists love to say, oh, but she recommended this book that you're saying she copied from. Well, you can just study the history and you find when she was confronted about copying, whether it's Health Reformers or whichever other book you want to point to, she would always deny it. Oh no, I never read that. I never even seen the book. Just absolute blanket denials. And then she would try to act after she claimed she had her visions and wrote out all of her stuff. Oh, I happened to read this book that's so much like what God showed me. It's just, you got to really be naive. And but Adventists are, that's what they're trained to believe, that the prophet has spoke. This came directly from God. If you don't believe this, you're going to hell. You're spitting in God's face.
Right.
That's the way they think.
Yeah.
That's the way they're taught. And even though, the more sophisticated ones now know that's nonsense, like these scholars. The funny thing is, this scholar book got kicked out. they they had 12 scholars who are all well known. Many of them were university presidents and stuff. And they wrote this book trying to say, yeah, we really accept all the evidence of the last 50 years, but we still see a redeeming place for Ellen White as a devotional writer. And the White estate blew up and hacked the book. The book had like 26 copies made for readers like myself. And then it got canceled by Pacific Press. So the whole book's been shut out and cut
Right.
out. It's so funny because these guys, they're smart people, but it's like with the blacks. You ask, well, why wouldn't they be leaving in mass?
Yeah.
Well, you have a huge black movement. You have a huge black university, Oakwood University. You've got all kinds of blacks that have tremendous status and prestige as black pastors and church leaders. These people make sure they're not going to lose their positions. I'll tell you that. And that's the same with Adventist academics. they don't have any place to go. There's very, very few Adventist academics that can go teach at UCR or UCLA. Or when I left Adventism, I went to UCLA and worked for them. But that's very, very few Adventists that can do that. And so, it's self-preservation. They have to spit the party line out to keep their jobs, their pensions. It's self-preservation is
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, I find it disturbing that the Evangelical Theological Society has Adventists present papers there. I find
Yeah.
that very disturbing. But and just a very quick question. I heard one Adventist pastor tell me, well, if Ellen White was such a great, I mean, if she was the leader and the inspired prophet, why was she exiled to Australia for about 7 years or so? And so they will say, well, look, see, she wasn't in absolute control. They had her go to Australia as well, kind of as a form of discipline. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. Ellen White was by far the most powerful and most controlling person after James died. There's absolutely no question about that. But she also did a lot of stupid stuff. She's writing in the 1880s that it's too late for anyone to get married. No one should have children. She's still trumpeting the same stupidity about the Lord's coming is so soon. She would write and say a lot of stupid things. And her plagiarism caught up with her in 1889. It was publicly, uh, published in the Hillsburg paper in a series of articles, and gave all kinds of examples and concluded that Ellen was a terrible plagiarist. That was their conclusion, that this woman was a terrible plagiarist. And so it was right at that time. There were two reasons Ellen was sent off to Australia. One, because she betrayed all the church leaders with regard to 1888. She even betrayed Uriah Smith, who'd come to her aid many times, and G.I. Butler, who was the GC president. She completely lied to them. They were opposing Wagner and Jones, who presented at the 88 conference, based on a vision of Ellen that was given way back in 1854, condemning Wagner's father, J.H. Wagner. And so when E.J. Wagner and Jones start preaching this righteousness by faith stuff, Ellen is told by, Smith and Butler, hey, they're preaching the very stuff you condemned back in 1854. So she condemned them again, right before the 88 conference. And she said, hey, but I don't want this argument. You guys are fighting with each other in our own church publications. You're making fools of us. We look like we're morons because we don't agree. So just shut up about this stuff. And I'll tell them they're wrong, and we'll leave it at that. So she tells them they're wrong, and Butler and Smith go crazy rejoicing. Butler writes a big book. Ellen White said they're wrong. Smith writes all these articles in the review. Wagner and Jones are idiots. They're going against the testimonies. So Ellen's so angry about this that she says, okay, because you guys have disobeyed me, I'm going to let them speak at the General Conference in 88. So that's why Wagner and Jones speak the whole time. And their topic is the law of God in Galatians and Romans, the very same book that Ellen condemned of J.H. Wagner's in 1854. They say the exact same thing that she condemned back then. But now she sees all the people are loving this. It's super popular. So she completely goes against goes against Smith and Butler. Butler's so destroyed by this, he leaves the GC presidency. Smith is just so devastated that he no longer believes in the visions the way he had before. And Ellen gets new visions of how she's going to write all these books about Jesus now, because this message is so popular. And now she's saying all this great stuff about Wagner and Jones because she's writing this popular wave that they're on. So she writes Desire of Ages, Mount of Blessing, Christ Object Lessons, Steps to Christ. She never understood the true gospel. she never understood what Wagner and Jones were saying on their primary topic, was the law in Romans and Galatians. She always kept holding on to the Adventist worship of the law and religion under law. But now she wanted to trumpet the righteousness by faith part, and she starts saying all this pro stuff about righteousness by faith, which was the opposite of the legalism and perfectionism she had trumpeted her whole life before that. But anyway, she betrayed all the church leaders, so they wanted her butt out of there. And then she's getting ridiculed in the public press. So the church is saying, "Hey, we got to get this woman out of here. She's really coming under major fire." So they send her off to Australia. And it's true, she didn't really want to go. She acted like she did, and she got treated like a big queen there. But when she was in Australia, she wrote to Olson, who was the new GC president, and she said, "What you did sending me here was not of God. God had nothing to do with it. And God tells me what's true," Um, so she was there with A.G. Daniels, and the two of them plotted that whole 10-year period, what they were going to do when they came back, and they took over the GC. Daniels became the GC president. Him and Ellen White were super tight. She plugged him, he plugged her. They were the two most powerful people by far in Adventism. Then after Ellen died, Daniel started talking openly about, well, she didn't really have the visions that she claimed. She wasn't who she claimed to be and all.
Right.
So he's real honest at the 1919 Bible conference, but then that gets him fired for being honest. So it's a mess.
Yeah, it is.
It's the most deceptive. I always talk about the spirit of dishonesty. There's not just a spirit of hypocrisy
Yeah.
in Adventism. There's a ridiculous spirit of dishonesty from the founding to the present day.
Right.
It's unbelievable how bad it is.
No. Just wanted to thank Jab for your donation there. The Education Tonight, great guest. We have another Christ Alone, No Rome. God bless you in Christ, brethren. Just another question here, Steve. Someone had asked a question about what Ellen G. White taught about the Trinity. What was her view of the Trinity?
Of course, the Methodist Church taught Orthodox views of the Trinity. The Shouting Methodists weren't Orthodox at all. But Ellen, as I say, was not a theologian. She wasn't a historian. She didn't know much of anything, honestly. She had a third grade, some say fifth grade, with her self-teaching education. But, as Veltman said, she was always derivative. She took everything from other sources. And the primary sources she took it from the first many years were Bates and her husband. And so she was taking, even though she didn't talk much about the nature of Christ, she didn't really come out and promote the same hatred of the Trinity and stuff that James and Bates had. She was just silent. She wouldn't say much on that because she knew better from her Methodist background, but she never contradicted them. She never went against what they were saying, against Jesus being God, against the Trinity. She let them spout their stuff, but she, to her credit, at least she didn't claim God showed her that was true, like she did for most of the doctrines that they spit forward. And once they both died, and she was kind of the queen bee, she did move to more orthodox positions on the Trinity and the nature of Christ and that kind of stuff, although she always had problems with the nature of Christ. Adventism has this last generation theology, this model man theology. What we have to do is perfectly reproduce Christ's character in order for him to return. That's all Ellen White stuff. And she was doing that way up into the 1900s. So even with her claim to accept righteousness by faith, she still had a lot of perfectionistic, legalistic garbage mixed into her teachings.
I had one Adventist pastor tell me Steve, that James White, and again, when I say James White, folks, I don't mean James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries. I mean Ellen G. White's husband.
Right.
So I heard an Adventist pastor say, "Oh no, Tony. James White did accept the Trinity before several months before he died. Is that true? Do you know anything in your research, Steve, that supports that assertion?"
It's a claim that Adventists make, but I don't think there's just as many historians that say he never went back on his anti-Trinitarian views. And there's certainly not much written one way or the other as he's nearing his death and stuff. That was a much bigger issue early on in the movement when they were fresh out of the Christian Connection movement, which was really hostile to the Trinity and really hostile to the notion that Jesus was God, to the point where they ridiculed it and made fun of it. And, I think that they mellowed a little bit as they became power brokers in Adventism. Then they were much more worried about politics and making money and position and all that kind of stuff. So they weren't going to be saying the kind of controversial things. They learned a lot from being made fools of with the shut door and all that kind of stuff. But, they still had repeated errors and mistakes for years and years and years. They were never orthodox, either Bates or James, nor was Ellen ever orthodox in the way that we would think of true Orthodox Christianity.
My apologies. I was muted. This commentator, I loved your book, Steve. The way Ellen G. White treated, gaslit, and conned her team of writers, Fanny Bolton and Marion Davis, into propping her work and claiming others as her own was truly disgusting. And I have to share that. I have to share the AJW's comment here too. When I read your book on how these poor women were treated, and how one was even forbidden from marrying, and then in the end ended up in an asylum. It was absolutely disgusting the way Ellen White treated these people.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
I kind of liken it to Bernie Madoff,
Mm-hmm.
Ellen White was a high-functioning sociopath. We need to remember that. So the people that liked her thought she was this great grandma, motherly, loving, wonderful saint. And she kept it that way with the people that supported her and drank the Kool-Aid. But anyone who questioned her, doubted her, that's when all hell was released. And these people were destroyed. And that's typical of a high-functioning sociopath. That's the way they operate. And, before Bernie Madoff was exposed as a fraud, people could say, oh, he was the president of the NASDAQ. Look at all these people he helped with investments. Well, once he's exposed as a fraud, nobody says that anymore because they realize he did it all through fraud. And the same is true with Ellen White. When you realize she did it all through fraud and dishonesty, I don't care if she was the founder of Loma Linda University. I don't care. A good tree produces good fruit, Jesus said, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. God overcomes evil with good. So there are good things that have come out of Mormonism and Adventism because God overcomes evil with good. But that doesn't make a bad tree good, and it doesn't make a false prophet true. I'll just end with that.
Yeah, very well said, Steve. Very well said. So, folks, just want to remind you again, Dr. Steve Bailey's book, Ellen G. White, A Psychobiography. And I love your cover, by the way, Dr. Daly, because I wrote a book called No King But Christ, and we both seem to have a lion there.
All right.
And so, folks, please do get Dr. Bailey's book. This is a great book. I've read it myself, and I highly recommend it. So there's a link to Dr. Bailey's website below. You could find access to his books, not just this one, but his other books are worth your time to read them. Or if you want to just take a quick look at Amazon, I'm sure it's posted there as well. And again, my book, No King But Christ, there's a link in the description box. The Collapse and Bankruptcy of Secular Worldviews. So it deals with the place of Christians in our world today. It deals with topics like social justice and the whole woke movement and transgenderism and the supremacy of Christ as King.
Amen.
So I would encourage you to get that as well. But Dr. Daly, thank you so much for being on. And I know you've given us a lot of information to digest, and a lot of that is in your book as well. And I praise God for you and the fact that He brought you out of Adventism so that you could take this information, give it to us. And for those of you who are Seventh Day Adventists and you're watching this, please know that neither I nor Dr. Daly mean any harm to you. We have no ill feelings towards you.
Amen.
We love you for the sake of Christ.
Amen.
And we want to see you experience the true Sabbath, the one who gives eternal rest, not once a week, but eternal rest, and to enter into his rest. So Dr. Daly, before I let you go, you are also a pastor. Can you just say a little bit about your church and if there's anyone who'd like to attend your church if they live in California?
Yeah, it's in Riverside, California on Orange Street. It's called Graceway Community Church. We've been going for 15 years. We're interdenominational, extremely Christ-centered, no king but Christ.
Amen.
And we believe in the perfect finished work of Christ as the source of every good thing, and preach that and teach that and live that all we can.
Amen. Amen. And soli Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. So thank you again, everyone, for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, absolutely free. Please share this video with your Seventh Day Adventist friends, relatives. Let them hear this information. And thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to end with the words of the great, the great hymn writer John Newton. When he was at the end of his life, he said, "I don't remember very much, but there are two great truths that I've known. And that is, number one, I'm a great sinner, but Christ is a much greater Savior." And Amen. So we pray that you come to know him. So thank you again, Dr. Daly. The Lord bless you. And hopefully maybe in the future, we'll have you on again.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Take care,
thank you.
brother.
All right.
Blessings. Bye-bye now.